Hello and welcome to the Brain Injury Group podcast Evolving Minds, where we share insights, information and guidance to individuals and families post-brain injury and the professionals supporting them. Thanks as always to our sponsors, Abilities Enabled. Today I'm joined by Dr. Keith Jenkins, who is a clinical neuropsychologist. Keith, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then today we're going to talk about dating and relationships post-brain injury.
Okay. Well, I'm a consultant clinical neuropsychologist. I'm currently the lead psychologist at St Andrews Healthcare, where they've been delivering specialist neurorehabilitation since the late 1970s. I've not been here that long, but for quite a while now. I first started to work with people living with brain injury back in the early 1990s. And as well as beginning my education about how life can be changed by brain injury, it also brought me into contact with Headway, the Brain Injury Association and the national charity for people living with brain injury. And I started working with Headway, South East London, North West Kent, and was lucky enough to be the chair of that particular group that ran a day service and offered support for families and relatives of people living with brain injury. I worked for the NHS in London in a rehab unit, then moved to work with an independent unit which became part of Priory in East Sussex, and then following my work there moved here to St Andrews in Northampton in 2003. And then I moved my Headway group, so I'm currently the chair of Headway East Northants, where we have a day service and again are providing support for people living with brain injury, but also their families and loved ones. And in my work here at St Andrews, I helped set up a family support group where partners and parents of people who have had brain injury are able to meet together, and where, at their request, I'll sometimes obtain a professional colleague to come and answer their questions or speak about their particular area of work. So I've ended up being fully immersed in the world of brain injury. My understanding is still far from complete because it's very much a unique experience for each person and each family that's affected by brain injury. But I hope I'll be able to share some of my experience with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That I think the challenges with supporting individuals following a brain injury are vast because that is such a complex area and so very different for each individual. And you also mentioned the family support groups there and the fantastic work that Headway do across the UK. And the impact on families following an individual's brain injuries is vast as well, and everybody is trying to navigate this new normal that sometimes the impacts aren't available to you. You're not understanding of them for much later after the injury has occurred, I think. Not least the fact of a personal relationship in that situation, so a spouse, a long-term partner and how the dynamics of that change. And I think we're going to explore all areas of dating and relationships as time allows today. But I think if we start with those existing relationships and the changing dynamics for individuals and spouses who perhaps have in the early days of the relationship had to take on a little bit of a caring role and then trying to figure out what their marriage or their long-term adult relationship looks like post-brain injury and some of the challenges that are faced there.
Yeah, I think like most things in life and certainly like most things in psychology, there are multiple variables or factors that determine how for an individual person and their family they're going to respond to the trauma of brain injury and the changes it brings about. But for example, some very important ones are the quality of the relationship before the brain injury. So a brain injury is not going to make an already struggling relationship any better. And so that's one of the challenges, that people who have a relationship that already is maybe slightly rocky or has some difficulties, the brain injury to a member of that relationship can be the final straw. There isn't enough resilience and coping patience within that relationship for it to survive the impact of brain injury. So that's already one key variable. How good were things before the brain injury.
Yeah.
Another key variable that's been found in much research is whether there are children present in that relationship. Because most often it will be the male partner in a relationship that sustains the brain injury, leaving their partner with childcare responsibilities for themselves now, but also often those caring responsibilities for their partner. And people will often talk about it feeling as if there is another child in the family, albeit they may be talking about their 35, 45-year-old male partner, but how they're affected by their brain injury may mean that their control of impulses, their focus on themselves and difficulty with empathising with others, and their challenge in coping with the noise of children may mean it feels to their partner like they're now having to deal with another child. So quality of relationship, whether there are children present, are significant variables that start to determine how things are going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's really hard, isn't it, to remain. It's hard in every longer term relationship to keep that romance, if you like, or the those positive benefits of a long term relationship go in and not get into that sort of rigid routine of the day-to-day life. And I imagine with those caring responsibilities on top of that, even for a strong relationship before the brain injury, it's a tough challenge to figure out how to navigate that after the brain injury. And I would imagine in your work you've seen some challenges there from families, but also maybe some families who've had some positive experiences of looking at what the new normal looks like for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably it does relate to how the relationship was working before brain injury, but certainly I remember working with clients down at Headway, South East London, North West Kent, where our people that came to our day service, their wives were actually able to find some kind of respite in their going to the day service, but also they were managing to negotiate a relationship with someone whose needs were changed. But a particular couple that I'm thinking of, in fact, interestingly, didn't have any children. So possibly that caring relationship, those caring skills that the female partner in this relationship had were able to be fully engaged by her husband, who had quite significant difficulties and changes in emotional expression due to his brain injury. So sometimes there can just be a good fit between the stage of life of the partner, their particular needs or skills around relationship, and then the needs of their brain injured partner. But the difficulty that can often emerge is one of feeling like it's become a different person when your loved one has had a brain injury. So this isn't the person that I signed up to live with, that I married, or that I entered into a long-term commitment with, and feelings such as desire for that person, feelings such as do I feel supported by them, can be very significantly affected. So sadly, on more than one occasion in my work here at St Andrews, I've had to be there to support wives as they've said to their husband that they won't be coming home and that their relationship is going to be of a different nature because of them having a severe brain injury. And of course, that's at the more significant end of brain injury effects. And there are many men and women living in the community who haven't needed specialist inpatient services, who are getting by, but are still dealing with similar issues, albeit maybe at a different level of intensity. People talk about life-changing injuries in all sorts of settings and contexts, but really a significant acquired brain injury is a life-changing injury that affects all of the lives connected to that person who sustains the injury.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there a particular family you were speaking to or spouses coming to some of the groups at Headway. And do you think that if we were better at supporting the wider family after an individual's had a brain injury, particularly their spouse or long-term partner, that that we would be able to navigate some of these challenges in relationship post-brain injury, that if the support was given to the person who hadn't had the brain injury in that relationship alongside whatever support their loved one is getting, that perhaps we could help to navigate some of those changes that the spouse is feeling, that the person that they're with is significantly different, or even just some slight changes in their behaviour that impact the thoughts and feelings and ability to continue with your relationship.
Absolutely. I think some kind of professional or trained support can make a very big difference to a relationship that is put under strain because of acquired brain injury. But two things come to mind actually. One is a couple that I worked with where they were actually able to come and see me during the daytime. I'll come back to that time reference in a moment. But they could come and see me during the daytime, and what became clear was that the brain injured man involved in this relationship was so focused on wanting to be able to work and feel he was having as ordinary a life as possible that he was getting home and then was completely wiped out by the energy that had been used at work and by the fatigue that we know is a very common consequence of brain injury. So with them, it was a case of helping them discover and helping him discover that there was value and compromise to be gained in reducing his working hours so he had more to put into their relationship, so that there was the chance that he could join in some joint pursuits with his wife and their child, rather than coming home and just being flaked out on the sofa whilst mum continued to care for and provide support for her child, as she'd already been doing all day. So that's kind of the intervention around practicalities that we can do. And say in that case, they were able to see me during the daytime. But the majority of partners of people living with injury are likely to have other commitments during the day, or indeed be desperately trying to continue working themselves. And it's a real challenge, to professional colleagues when you say to them, we need to do a support group, but actually it's going to need to run between 7 p.m. in the evening and 9 p.m, because that's when people will be home from work, will have had their tea, and can hopefully come along and join a support group. And I believe very strongly in that. And it's about, as a professional, you need to either adjust your hours overall or make that sacrifice that in order to deliver a much needed service, you're there at the right time. Otherwise, it's no wonder people don't turn up or don't turn up consistently. If what you're offering is a support group that meets 1 till 2 p.m. in the afternoon, that may suit you and your venue, but it's actually not really helpful to people living an ordinary life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that making time for people and sharing those experiences as well within a support group, it's not just that support from you and perhaps colleagues who have got that professional understanding, knowledge and experience, but also understanding that you're not on your own and there are other people who have experienced similar situations to you. I think that's a very valid point about spouses continuing to try and keep the normality in their life as well, and their working life or whatever they did before the injury happened, and that support network is really important, but making that at the right time and giving people the space to deal with their working and sometimes their caring responsibilities, getting the children to bed perhaps so that things are calm in the house and they do feel comfortable leaving, is really important, isn't it? That peer support as well, I think.
I think peer support, in some respects, if we can facilitate it or provide the right setting conditions, is the most powerful support, because unless your clinician, your professional, has got some lived experience credibility which they're able to share or which is obvious from their presentation, then you're always going to be thinking, yeah, but they don't really know what it's like, especially if they're making a suggestion for something that might be helpful and may well be grounded in the research and science, but you're hearing it and thinking, I can't do that, or that doesn't make sense. If that person saying that to you doesn't have the added credibility of, well, actually, they're living the life too, you're just going to dismiss it. So peers often can say the things that the professional in a group meeting is thinking, but they're much better said by another member of that peer group, because it's heard as carrying so much more weight.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe somebody that's a little bit further along that journey of post brain injury life that can say, look, we did have those struggles early on while we navigated and things settled into our new routine, but now things are improved, or you can say that this is no longer working for you, or whatever that might be that's right for those individuals. What about the element of perhaps from the perspective of the person who's had the brain injury? Maybe they are, like you say, like the chap who's trying to get back into work and trying to get his own sort of habits and routine back into some sort of normality. And perhaps do you see where spouses have maybe taken away some of that decision-making ability of their injured spouse, and that has impacted the relationship? So probably spouses need to protect their loved one, having seen them go through such a traumatic event, and trying to curtail some of their autonomy or decision-making abilities, where they're able to make those decisions, obviously, and that having a dynamic on their ability to maintain a relationship.
Yeah, I think we do see that, and it's something, I guess, that has far more of a spotlight on it at the current stage of kind of our culture of care, and the focus on least restrictiveness and on autonomy. So perhaps where previously people would have been much more paternalistic and enveloping and protective, there is this felt pressure to empower and deliver autonomy. And work such as that's guided by the Mental Capacity Act obviously drives the need to do that. But sometimes that vulnerability, that difference between what somebody says they will do and what they actually do in reality, isn't well picked up. So I think it can cause great difficulty on occasion for spouses that are really encouraged to let their partner get on and do things, whereas they know from their very close personal experience, oh, this is going to go badly. But we, the professionals, are talking about autonomy and least restrictiveness, and also are probably mindful that the brain injured person is feeling somehow wrapped up in cotton wool or restricted, and doesn't understand why their loved one is doing that restriction, because they have got concerns potentially around impulsive expenditure, or making disinhibited comments in public that could be embarrassing at the very least, or can even generate harm. So I think we do see that kind of tension between how much can I let my partner do and how much do I need to step in and do things for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of those existing relationships at the time of a brain injury, if we do have any individuals, spouses, families that are listening to the podcast and are struggling with that situation, what do you think is the best thing that they can do to try and sort of navigate that and get some support?
I think getting support's possibly key, because when you're working with your loved one who's living with a brain injury and you're trying to help them maybe manage some aspect of their life in a way that is adjusted because of some changes in their ability to cope or manage due to their brain injury, if those top tips or suggestions or pointers are coming from a loved one, there's another dynamic in play in terms of, should I let my partner tell me what to do? Or why am I letting my son tell me what to do? So on occasions like that, having a professional involved can be more helpful, because they're seen, hopefully, as neutral. And again, I can remember working with a couple where their relationship was struggling, where the brain injured partner, he really was struggling again to give enough time to his partner, to give some due consideration, to give some positive relationship time. And with them, one of the things we worked on was just the very basic idea of having a regular date night, actually setting aside the time to go out and to be there just for each other, which I think they did find quite positive, but it needed an external to suggest, because I'm sure that his partner had said many times, let's go out, or you never take me out, and that wasn't actually going to resolve it. People get stuck, and they need a little bit of support from the outside. If that support can be well managed and be felt as neutral, or as I've done in some cases, you need to work with a co-therapist or a partner with you in the work that you're doing, so that within the actual work, one of you might be perceived as the ally of the person living with brain injury, whilst the other one is perceived as the ally of the partner. And so you can then yourselves as therapists mirror discussing things and working out what's a sensible thing to do, and then feed that back. So they can both feel supported and have an ally, and you can model how you as therapists have a conversation in front of them about what's the best way forward, and that hopefully gives them a sense of, well, we're balancing things here. It's not just everything to suit him or everything to suit her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that support element is key, and we would encourage people to reach out either to ourselves or Headway, and we can put you in touch with the relevant Headway in your area, whoever that is, to try and get some help and support in that area if you are struggling. Turning now to dating and new relationships, which is a whole different dynamic for those individuals who perhaps weren't in a relationship, or the relationship's broken down after the brain injury, and their family and friends that are supporting them in that, and the sort of complexities of navigating that world. Do you sort of see some common challenges there in that area?
I think what immediately comes to mind, and it's an experience I've had obviously working within inpatient services a lot, but also when you see people coming to a community-based service, is that for people living with brain injury, finding a relationship can be very difficult. And what you see is that when somebody does find someone that they're attracted to, where they would like a relationship, they will go from 0 to 100 incredibly quickly. There isn't the pacing, there isn't the more appropriate getting to know. And some of that, of course, is about a degree of disinhibition that some people may have, but some of it's about a frustration, a need that's been so long unmet that when there's an opportunity that people rush. And certainly that's a very common experience if you're working in an inpatient service where men are on single sex wards, that when they get the chance to go to a mixed event, there's not a lot of thinking that goes on when there's the opportunity to meet some women and to try to strike up a rapport or a relationship. So that's one of the risks, being lonely and not having the chance of a relationship. When an opportunity comes along, there's not the same, perhaps, thinking it through and taking time. And a whole host of other variables to do with the cognitive and emotional changes that may have come from brain injury play a role there. And in the meantime, there might be a parent or parents that are thinking that their son or their daughter is actually incredibly vulnerable because of their brain injury, and they'd have seen real life examples of that. And then they'll be terribly concerned about them getting into a relationship, and will maybe want to be present more than would be the norm. And if there's something like a compensation settlement that's been made for the person living with brain injury, then it becomes remarkably difficult for parents or a parent to be fully trusting of the motives of the person that now is interested in their son or their daughter, which must be awful for the person that's being perceived in that way, if that perception is an incorrect one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in everyday life, when somebody enters into a new relationship, it's an exciting time, it's a happy time, it's a we're getting to know you, we're progressing things in a nice way. But then you've got that added pressure, like you say, of the risks and the vulnerability that perhaps is perceived of individuals after a brain injury. And I suppose for family members, getting that balance right of allowing somebody that human contact and those human relationships, and being able to progress that in the hope that it turns into something, fruitful and long term, but whilst feeling that you've still got that protection for that individual, and you can support them should it turn out that that's not either either the relationship naturally comes to its ends after a few dates or whatever, which again is a normal thing, or whether it is becoming a harmful relationship. I think that balance for families is probably very challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the other balance in the brain injury world that makes relationships even more difficult is that there are more men who've had a brain injury than women. So something that would be an experience held in common, and it might also be an experience held in common that sees people going to similar places, doesn't have the same facilitating effect it would have if there was a more equal number of people from different sex and gender that were going to these events. So it's often quite difficult for men living with brain injury to find women that maybe get it because they've lived through it themselves, and women where perhaps people will be less inclined to ask those questions about what's the motivation here. It'll be, well, I found someone with whom I've got a major thing in common and we get on really well. I did see one example of a marriage through one of the Headway groups that I was involved with. The man and woman actually met at the Headway service and developed a relationship and went on to marry and have a child. I mean, sadly and frustratingly, really, for the happy ending wish that one would have, it then proved quite difficult once a child came along for the relationship to work in the way it did do before. Because all of a sudden, the female partner had a child to care for, whilst her male partner found that really hard because of the nature of his brain injury. And sadly, as a relationship and as a parenting couple, that wasn't able to survive. So it's incredibly fraught with difficulty and incredibly sad that the challenges in having just something that many people take for granted and having it run smoothly, yet people do still try really hard to achieve that. And I think professionals and volunteers with groups like Headway need to do our best to support people to get what we take for granted. But in order to do that, we've got to help make accommodations, do things in a bespoke way for that particular person and their relationship.
Our Adult Brain Injury Conference is taking place on the 11th and 12th of June 2026 at the Lowry in Salford Quays, Manchester. It brings together legal, healthcare and case management professionals for 2 days of expert insight, discussion and collaboration, focused on improving outcomes for adults with brain injury. The conference is APL accredited and delegate tickets are available on the Brain Injury Group website. Search Adult Brain Injury Conference to find out more.
Would you encourage the discussions with the family and the brain injured individual, perhaps like the Headway groups or other support groups that they might attend, to talk openly about the challenges of new relationships and where possible to try and build that sort of understanding a little bit more for the injured person, so that they can see it's not a pressure of their own family are putting on them to ruin their relationships or stifle their relationships. It's a common thing that it is important for everyone to understand. Is it possible to have those sorts of discussions at the support groups, do you think?
I think you probably could have those sorts of discussions at a support group, but I think probably it would need to be a support group of a similar group of men and men or women who are seeking a relationship. I think when you try to do groups where you kind of blend, if you like, parents and their brain injured loved ones, that can be fraught with difficulty. I mean, my most kind of crushing experience of that was with Headway in South East London, where one evening we decided we were going to do some support groups, some peer support. But what we did is we had one group which was people living with brain injury, talking about their life, their experience, and I guess their perception of how their parents or loved ones were involved in their lives. The other group was the parents and loved ones talking about how their lives were changed and what they needed to do for their brain injured relative. So as separate groups, it went okay. Then, as a major mistake, we decided to bring the groups together and to give feedback from each of the groups. Well, that was awful. And in particular because for some of the people living with brain injury, they didn't get the feedback. It didn't make sense. They didn't have that same awareness or perception of the interactions and how maybe their loved one, parent or partner was struggling. So that's made me learn that some things need to be dealt with within the group, and certainly dealing with the things that you're not happy about. That needs to be done very carefully, and be very well supported, because otherwise, almost what you do is you just strike a match and throw it in and start a big fire.
So maybe more within separately, and then bringing that together within that individual family unit, so it can be managed alongside somebody's ability to understand and being fed back in a way that is more helpful to that situation.
I think so, absolutely. I think having groups in those situations, you probably generate too much emotional fuel, which, as I say, could suddenly be set alight. Whereas I think with a young man or a young woman, having a conversation with them, having a conversation with their parents, and then bringing them together, you're going to be trying to smooth over things and help them come to a shared understanding and a shared plan about how things are going to go, where both parties will need to compromise, and parents may need to take a positive risk, but also their adult child who they are caring for may also need to understand as best they can why their parents are worried, and try and offer something that's going to be a token of reassurance in some respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I suppose there's the added sort of challenge there, where maybe somebody has had a brain injury as a child or a young person, and is now reaching adulthood. So pre-brain injury, they'll have probably never had an adult relationship. There may not have been any conversations within the family about their thoughts, their feelings, whether they like somebody of the same sex or a different sex or across all genders, and what that looks like, and that individual's probably still trying to navigate those thoughts and feelings themselves as they come up to the relevant age. So I think there's a few more challenges there, isn't there, as young people age into adulthood. And it's hard enough. I'm the parent of a 15-year-old boy who is, reaching the age of what may happen next in their personal relationship situation. And I think that's going to be very difficult for me as a mum anyway, to sort of let him go off into the world and experience the different things that he may want to experience. But where you've supported your child or young person through a brain injury, and they've got to adulthood, and you're very proud of where they've come to, but then those questions and challenges and needs to have that personal connection arise. For families, that's probably a really challenging time, as well as for the young person themselves who's now an adult.
I think you're absolutely right. I think for the young person with brain injury, there's almost a double jeopardy that occurs for them. One is, as you described, that they've not had the more standard experience of psychosexual development in growing up, from child through adolescence to young adulthood. So they've not had the practice at the various levels of getting to know people, interacting with them, and, as you say, discovering who or what they like as part of their sexual development. That's not happened. So that's one jeopardy, that they've not had any of the kind of real life training and experience that people put into play when they're trying to build a more significant and meaningful relationship. And then the other jeopardy is the change in them because of their brain injury, where there may be a degree of disinhibition, a degree of not reading the signs correctly. When somebody is clearly giving you a sign they're not interested in you chatting them up, that there's a loss of the appropriate social skills, if you like. So we have tried on occasion in work that I've done here to kind of take young men who've had that experience. Their brain injury's been when they're very young. They've not had ordinary psychosexual development. Their approaches to women are clumsy and disinhibited, and trying to take them through social skills training, trying to take them through what you do talk about when you first meet a woman and what you don't talk about when you first meet a woman, and then giving them opportunities to practice that with female staff. And I think it kind of has mixed success, really, in that some of the guys kind of do get it and they do acquire the knowledge, but then it's that dreadful dissociation that you sometimes come across in people living with brain injury, that knowing doesn't then translate to doing. And that's something we continue to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I suppose the challenge across all new relationships for anyone, but particularly where you've mentioned the disinhibition sometimes associated with brain injury, but also that not only knowing the right conversations to have at the right time, but knowing when perhaps a relationship is ready to move on to that next stage from a sexual perspective or not, and what those signs are, because they're often very nuanced, aren't they? And there are often challenges in a relationship where there isn't a brain injury, and understanding that with a brain injury. Then on top of that, like you mentioned, if it's a young person that hasn't had those experiences beforehand, how can we support individuals to navigate those sorts of things? These might be feelings that they've never felt before, or they might be different to how they've been felt in the past.
I think there's a range of psychosexual educational materials out there, much of which have been developed for people with learning disability, but can actually be adjusted and adapted for people with an acquired brain injury, because we're talking about, in the main, people whose injuries would have occurred in early childhood, possibly pre-pubescent. So at that stage of life, the materials that have been designed for people with a developmental disability would be able to be used. Some of the basics of education about rights and wrongs of behaviour. There's a lot of sort of safety information that's used in education for people, pictorial and social stories about situations going on to help people learn what is safe and what maybe should be ringing bells in your head because it's going in an unsafe direction. It's difficult for all young people out there, I think, nowadays. And of course, another element is the invent of online dating or meeting people, which is something that people living with brain injury are also able to do, but bring that vulnerability, that maybe exposing themselves and saying things about them at a much faster rate than somebody without a brain injury would, which then exposes them to risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose at the point in time in making somebody aware that you've maybe got some challenges as a result of your brain injury, with other injuries, illnesses, disabilities, we can manage that a little bit easier. But actually with a brain injury, it's when is it important, when is it relevant to bring that forward, so that perhaps some of the things that aren't happening in quite the way that the other person expects can be understood, and that person, and also, is this going to be something worth pursuing? Is that person going to be able to understand that you might have some different needs than others, which is the same across all relationships, of course, but very, very particular needs is a result of a brain injury and some differences in the relationship that will need to be carried forward for it to be successful. Is there any sort of guidance that you have provided to individuals who are engaging with that online world? I would imagine online is a challenge anyway for any, online gaming or the online communications more broadly are a challenge post-brain injury, but then particularly applying that to the dating world. Are there any sort of steps or guidance that you think families should be aware of where their loved one is perhaps exploring those options of the online world, particularly with dating?
I think there's some kind of particular, if you like, cyber safety tips or guidance that's always useful to have in mind, or again, that are red flags. Obviously, if the person that you're interacting with is asking you for money, if they're asking to meet with you somewhere that isn't public for the first time that you meet, so there's a range of things that I think some coaching can help the person be aware of. And if the person has a trusting relationship with another family member or with a professional, it's kind of doing almost like a debrief with them in terms of how are things going with Mary in the calls that you're having. Saying, they're going great. She said she'd love to come and visit me, but she needs £500 to get the flight because she lives so far away. Not really. So it's a way of trying to work with the person, supporting the relationship, but equally being there to help them. Do you think it's a good idea to give them £500? How do you? And of course that would no doubt turn into quite a difficult conversation, because if I want a relationship and Mary, from what I can see online, looks very attractive and I want to meet her, then I might think it's well worth sending her £500. And then, of course, as we know from sad experiences that we hear ourselves in the media, yeah, then Mary will have an excuse why she's not turned up and why she now needs another £500. So it's that vulnerability which kind of brings in our kind of paternalistic, protective side. But I think if we can put the information there, that's our best try. But sometimes the nature of someone's brain injury will be that they won't believe it. They won't believe what we're saying. They will not agree. And some of that is not understanding necessarily what we're saying, but the other one is not wanting to believe what we're saying because it takes away a relationship. You know, I want to believe that this is my child, even though everybody else is saying it isn't. That's such a challenge at times.
Yeah, a huge challenge for everyone, I think, in that area. You mentioned something there about other trusted people within the relationship. Is that something that you think is a key part of sort of navigating these dynamics of being a parent, perhaps trying to support your child with a brain injury, with navigating new relationships, that perhaps it's not always going to be best coming from you? People don't always listen to us as parents. Children don't always listen to us as parents, no matter what the circumstance. But perhaps, like you mentioned there, being aware that within your family dynamic, broader family dynamic or friendship dynamic, that there may be somebody that is better placed in your world to get that message across to the young person.
Absolutely. I mean, it may be a brother or a sister, it may be a cousin, but somebody perhaps that's closer to you in age, that is seen as a peer. Again, kind of back to that notion that peers are the most powerful supports and may be more likely to be listened to, as you say, because parents will be perceived as having a range of motivations in what they're doing. So it might be feeling as if it's controlling, as if it's overprotective, as if they don't trust you, as if they don't think that you're an adult. Whereas a peer, the nature of the relationship is going to be different, and it will be, two peers talking about what seems safe and what doesn't seem safe, and some top tips on how to go about having more contact with this person, or how to manage the first meeting with them and where it should be. I think that's probably quite a good thought from yourself, to kind of find a way to separate building relationships from parents, because as you know, I don't think many young people discuss at that early stage their relationship. It might be later on they do, when they want maybe to take things further in terms of permanency or living together, that they will have a discussion with their parents if it involves moving out or some kind of parental support. But in terms of the initial building and getting to know each other and becoming close, that's not really something that most people would look for parental involvement with.
Yeah, and I think, so if families are finding that a challenge, or the individual with the brain injury themselves is finding that they're getting pushed back a lot of the time, because I'm also aware that family can be overprotective probably in this situation quite a lot of the time, in terms of their perception of somebody's vulnerability and stifling those relationships. Again, would you think that is either engaging with a professional like yourself, if they have someone involved, and sharing those thoughts and feelings so that we can navigate what that looks like moving forward, or if they aren't working with a professional like in your situation, one of those support groups more locally that have got other people who have experienced brain injury and maybe navigated these challenges themselves?
I think either of those would make sense, and indeed there are some sort of sex and relationship counsellors with particular knowledge or expertise around disability more generally, and that would include brain injury, who maybe can be supportive in those instances, both being aware of any particular legal ramifications of relationship building, but also being able to support a relationship in a more ordinary way in terms of the types of counselling and support for keeping safe, but also having a good relationship. And there's so many things to be navigated by a young man or a young woman who's had a brain injury in childhood, who is stepping out for their first relationship, and it's, I'm sure, pretty traumatic for the family as well to watch that and their worries, their concerns but also, as with any family, watching a child go out into relationships of their own, dealing with that change in their status and in their autonomy and independence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a sort of a really important point, isn't it? That you would feel like that as a family member anyway, and you've got the added pressure of the brain injury on top of that, which is sort of enhancing those feelings. I think where perhaps there's a professional deputy involved as well, and maybe that solves some of the issues with regards to the financial vulnerability of somewhere, because you've got that buffer of a professional. But equally then there is the professional risk for that deputy of where finances might be needed to support a new relationship or moving forward with a relationship perhaps when it's progressed a little bit. And again, I suppose in that situation, it's that allowing somebody to make a decision and that autonomy to make that decision for themselves in terms of the relationship, whilst ensuring as a professional you're not listening too much to the oversensitive worries perhaps sometimes of the family. You're listening to the voice of the individual, but you're acting in a professional way to manage those risks of the two sides of that coin. Any specific tips for those professionals perhaps that may be navigating that situation?
I suppose it's probably not as common as it needs to be, but just the same common sense you'd hope that somebody would bring to bear on what finance is being requested and for what. So, going back to our earlier example, if it's a request for £500 to fund a flight, that doesn't feel very appropriate, although it would need to be checked, because maybe it would be appropriate in some circumstances. But it's a request for £100 to go out for a date and have a meal out, that seems quite reasonable. So it's about using that knowledge of their client and his or her impulsivity around spending or lack of impulsivity, and just being clear about what's this money going to do. If it is to go out for a meal, if it is to buy a gift, again, if it's not an excessively expensive a gift that you think no one would buy something like that as a gift on the first time they meet somebody, and then it's about coming back to that education and trying to help the person get the perspective that's the most common perspective on how you do this. And also, a perspective that says, do you realise if you give her something as expensive as that, this is what she might think? Have you considered that? Because they won't have considered that, because that's a part of their learning that they've not had the chance to do because of their brain injury.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered a lot of elements here today. I wondered if there was any final thoughts from yourself on the topic of dating and relationships after a brain injury that might be important for families to think about, or individuals to think about who may be starting on this journey for themselves or their loved ones.
I think the thing that comes to mind and what kind of encouraged me with a colleague to set up a social club for people living with brain injury is the everyday real life opportunities for someone that has a significant brain injury to meet someone and have a relationship are incredibly limited. And although there is the opportunity to go online, there are so many risks inherent in that again, it's quite difficult. And equally, it's a good space where if somebody does share in their profile some things about themselves, to maybe find that they're either instantly rejected or attract the wrong kind of interest and attention. So I think it's about the need to find social opportunities to support your loved one living with brain injury, to get out there and to meet people. And that might be about going to a Headway social function or going to a Headway service on a regular basis. It might be going to some other organisation that copes for people with a range of ability, like a fab club or similar. But I do believe that relationships are largely built on having things in common. And I think the challenge for many people I work with who are living with brain injury is they kind of don't want the brain injury to be the thing they have in common. Yet it's the most powerful thing about them that they could start exploring a relationship with, in terms of having that in common with the man or the woman that they meet. And then, yes, it's the more standard, well, do I actually like them? Do they like the things I like? Do we have fun when we're together? Because if I think about, many people who build relationships, what they might have in common is they work in the same place. They've been to the same university. So having something in common, and it's generally, it's kind of like the biggest thing that you may have at that moment in time that you have in common, that then is the foundation, and then you do all of the other things around building a relationship. And the challenge is finding places where that foundation of shared experience of brain injury or disability more widely is something that brings people together to have fun, to socialise, and then with that commonality and that shared understanding of just how challenging life is, having gone through that experience, you can then see whether, actually, I quite like this person and they like the same activities as me. And there's not enough opportunities like that. That's a real need across the UK.
Absolutely, and I think probably from our perspective, to add at that point, we are trying to build on our directory a list of social opportunities that can be available alongside the lists of the Headway and the support groups that perhaps are being run by Headway and other charities. So yeah, if anybody is listening that does have any of those opportunities available, please let us know, and we're more than happy to share those too, because I think that's a really key, important point. Creating that social environment for somebody to feel safe and connect with other people is really valuable. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Jenkins. It's been really lovely to chat to you. I think we've been through quite a few bits of different topics and places within the dating and relationship world for our families and individuals after a brain injury. So really appreciate you joining us. We'll share some information alongside this post, and then if anybody's got any queries or questions, please let us know at the Brain Injury Group. But thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the Evolving Minds podcast. If you've got any questions about what we talked about, please get in touch via enquiries@braininjurygroup.co.uk. Any questions for Dr. Jenkins, we're more than happy to share those on your behalf. Or if you'd like to know more about social activities or Headway groups, please also get in touch. Thanks again to our sponsors, Abilities Enabled,